Well, let's cross live now to former Director of Intergovernmental Affairs for the US Trade Representative Steve Gill to get his thoughts. Steve, great to see you. So here we have the first talks between sitting US and Russian leaders in some 3 years. It feels significant. What is your view?
I think it's very significant, though I would caution these are the first steps towards hopefully resolving the Ukraine-Russia conflict and moving towards a more peaceful and prosperous situation for both Russia and the United States. But I think it's very good information, and I think that when President Putin and President Trump meet together in Moscow and then apparently in the U.S. or vice versa, that those face-to-face meetings will bear great fruit.
It's interesting how momentum works as well, isn't it? Because now you've got Donald Trump, opening the gates for talks with Vladimir Putin. Do you expect other leaders now to perhaps think, well, we can speak with him too and not get the criticism we may have received before?
Yeah, you can bet nobody wants to be left behind as this project moves in an entirely different direction than we've seen the last 3 years. And I think in addition to President Trump's conversation with President Putin today, you had Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth speaking in Europe today, making it clear that the blank check for Ukraine is over, that the European nations in NATO will have to be stepping up for more of their own defense costs rather than just depending on the U.S. to bear all the cost. So I think it's important what President Trump and Putin were doing, but also what Secretary of Defense Hegseth was saying. And then, of course, President Trump apparently also talked with President Zelensky of Ukraine. So all of these issues are moving very quickly on many different fronts. And I think it's hard to see it as anything other than good news at this point.
Yeah, just on the timing, as you mentioned there, of that talk with Vladimir Zelensky, it appears, we don't know for sure, but it appears that Mr. Trump spoke to President Putin first, before then telling Zelensky that this is what happened, this is what was talked about. Again, the fact that that happened after talking to President Putin, is that significant?
Well, apparently there had been a conversation between President Trump and President Zelensky a day or so ago where President Zelensky indicated he would be willing to trade land for peace. I find it kind of interesting. You can't trade land you don't have. So whatever Russia has already accumulated during this process isn't something that you're giving up if you don't actually have possession of that territory anymore. But I think the fact that Zelensky is talking in terms of finding a pathway to peace where Ukraine will give up some of their claims, and then the fact that President Trump and Zelensky apparently had this conversation where President Zelensky apparently has agreed to the transfer of $500 billion in minerals and oil and other resources to pay the U.S. back for what we have expended. Those conversations were before the conversation that President Trump had with President Putin. So again, I think that laid the groundwork for the progress that we are about to see.
The fact that they spoke for 90 minutes, Donald Trump was invited to Russia on a visit by Vladimir Putin. Do you think Mr. Trump would take up that offer and meet face-to-face with Vladimir Putin?
Oh, I think he will. I think that there will be meetings in both the U.S. and in Moscow. And maybe the President Trump, can have Tucker Carlson be his guide, even to that McDonald's in downtown Moscow that Tucker visited.
Yeah, indeed. We wait to see where they may turn out. You've also got Pete Hegseth, head of the Pentagon, saying in a NATO meeting earlier that Ukraine's return to pre-2014 borders is unrealistic, as well as Kiev's NATO membership, not holding back, going straight in with saying what you're not getting, and we go from there. Do you think that was already agreed between Russia and the US to come out and say that?
I don't think there was necessarily an agreement, but it is definitely a sharp turn from what we've heard from the U.S. the last 3 or 4 years under the Biden administration, where they kept holding out the idea that Ukraine would have NATO membership. That was agreed a long time ago that it would never happen. So what Pete Hegseth is expressing, what President Trump is embracing, is back to what we agreed before, which would be nice if we would keep our word. And if you move that NATO membership off the table, then that makes it a lot easier to reach a resolution with Russia, because that has been a bright line, red line that they were not willing to agree to under any circumstances. So I think again, when you start moving some of these items off the table, as Pete Hegseth has said, unrealistic to say we're going to go back to 2014. Crimea is not going back to Ukraine. The Donbass, Donetsk, Mariupol, they are not going back to Ukraine. I think making that clear makes it easier to move forward with serious negotiations dealing with reality. And you've seen some of the NATO generals and former generals express that the reality of what's happened on the battlefield needs to be dealt with rather than sort of the fantasy that has been expressed in the media and by NATO and European leaders the last several years. Let's deal with reality, which is one of the things Pete Hegseth also said, that will get us closer to a peaceful resolution.
Steve, if all that wasn't enough, another big story is emerging from the US, which we're going to get your thoughts on in just a moment. So stay with us if you will.